The Old School is brought to you by Ahart Solutions, which provides school surveys and applied research. More information at ahartsolutions.com. Good morning and welcome to The Old School, a podcast about the American education system and a host of other things, history, culture, food, sports. And today we enter into the trepid waters of politics. Yet we somehow remain unscathed because we're not dealing with American politics. With me in this endeavor is my good friend, Dr. Stephen Bourgeois. Good morning, Dr. Bourgeois.
Hi, Miller. It's good to see you today. I'm excited to talk about politics. It's my favorite subject because I can talk about it without actually saying anything. I've developed that technique. No one will know
That's called a politician, actually.
Yeah, I've talked politically about politics because for me it's a risk business wise. I'm agnostic as far as being paid by clients, and there are two sides to the education business, and so you use a lot of code when you talk. So I'll be using code today.
All right, very good. With us in this endeavor is Dr. Carrie Currier. Good morning, Carrie.
Good morning. I'm super excited to be here.
I'm super excited to have you here.
We're excited anytime it's not just the two of us.
Yes, the listeners tire of us very quickly, and we end up devolving into old jokes and inside baseball stuff, and it just becomes horrible. But thankfully, we have the very witty, the very energetic, the very smart Carrie Currier. She is professor of political science at Texas Christian University, heretofore TCU. And she is involved in many things, former department chair, but also she's the head of the East Asian Consortium that focuses on giving teachers the opportunity, free of charge, to learn about the various aspects of East Asia, not just China, but Japan, all throughout that region. And it's basically a exercise in deep diving into stuff that typically you would never get the chance to do. As I said, welcome, Carrie. How did you get involved in the East Asian Consortium?
It started a number of years ago. So it used to be housed at UNT with Dr. Harold Tanner, and then it moved to SMU with Dr. Johan Elverskog, and then I took it over in 2015. And so it is a great opportunity to learn more about Asia. The Freeman Foundation provides a very generous grant to help educate teachers and try to give them a way to incorporate East Asia into their classrooms. And so, that initial contact with them was really just presenting in some of the different programs that were in the Metroplex. And then since I took it over, I've been trying to grow the program, making sure as many people know about it. And again, like you said, it's free, and it's free education, and it's a great opportunity to learn about Asia and find some way to bring it into your classes.
Well, as Steve will attest, one time we were at a social studies conference, and the presenter, ostensibly a social studies teacher, remarked at one point that history was boring. And I just assumed that was a heretical remark, and I just assumed we were going to burn him at the stake at some point, at the very least pillory him out front of the facility. But alas, no. And so if you are a true historian, if you are a true study of other people's, this is something that you cannot pass up, because it's a free deep dive into all matter of things that you typically don't get a chance to study on your own accord in school, typically. And it's done by the best people in the business, and led by a very great person in the business. But before we get into that, I do have a question. We're going to sidetrack a little bit, because usually I start the episodes with a little bit of whimsy. Steve, you said that Wimbledon was unwatchable. Now, Carrie is a tennis fan and connoisseur. What was your argument about Wimbledon?
You're like blindsiding me. I'm a former tennis coach. I was a head tennis coach in Fort Worth and played many years, and go back to McEnroe and Borg actually saying that live in I think it was 1980. Um, I think that that something happened with the style of play. The points got shorter and shorter, and the men particularly. And we unfortunately don't know many of the players anymore that make it, except for the Djokovic who's now. So I'll probably watch the final tomorrow because that's historic. He could get another Grand Slam and beat his own record. But I think just that there aren't American players, and that's a little bit selfish. But not knowing who's playing is one thing. And it used to be a little bit more dramatic because of the names and that they didn't like each other. There was a intensity to the competition that's not there. So it's just watching. And so I'll watch for a couple points and say, okay. And I'm listening to John McEnroe speak, and he's more interesting than the play on the courts. But that's my first, and I can talk more about it if you want.
Well, I'm about ready to throw down and fight over this because I think Wimbledon is amazing. It's one of the classics, and I love tennis, and I do feel like watching the players, it's just such an amazing sport because it's starting to bring together more people, and having it on multiple surfaces, having the Grand Slams on multiple surfaces is interesting. And grass is tough. It's definitely tough.
One of the women in the finals is the Italian Paolini, and she had a bit of a good fortune against the American, whose name I can't recall at the moment because I think the American pulled up lane. She was injured, but the American was actually ahead and looked like she was about to take the match. But now Paolini finds herself having gone through another gauntlet and now finds herself in the final. So that's a fairly interesting showdown. And then um, Akaras, the Spaniard, on the men's
Alcaraz,
side. Yes. He is pretty fun to watch. I saw some of his early matches, one against the American. He was 12th ranked. I can't remember his name. I'm not a tennis aficionado, but I'm always curious. Anytime I come across tennis, I always go to Steve because Steve is my local resident expert in tennis. But you had said that, for all the failings of Wimbledon, there were other tournaments that fascinated you more. You mentioned a couple, did you not?
Um, I think the U.S. Open is kind of exciting just because the immediacy of the crowd is so raucous, and it tends to draw people in. But I think this Wimbledon thing has happened gradually for me because I would never miss it. I would have breakfast at Wimbledon. I'd actually have the strawberries and cream for breakfast myself and sit and watch. But I'd watch building up to it. But for some reason, it hasn't captured. Maybe I've lost my attention span or something. But I prefer watching the French Open because the points are longer, and it's not just bang bang. They've done
The game has changed.
yeah.
The game really has changed. So if you look at, grass courts now, you don't have the wear patterns of the net. And when you go back to the Edbergs and the Beckers and the Sampras's, they would come in, and now it is a lot more baseline play.
And that's interesting because it was setting up eventually to get to the net and volley, and you don't see the pattern. It's just banging. I mean, they're hitting really hard, ground strokes, big serves, but they're not tactically setting up, the point. And but that's where it gets exciting, I think, but pretty old school in that.
It does seem like strength is starting to take the place of finesse, and we see that in baseball as well. Where it's more about velocity. It's not about you now have throwers. You don't have pitchers. People who are actually have the chops to kind of pinpointly direct a ball. But well, we can. I think we've just discovered a new episode we can do later on.
It's great. We deconstructed it, but I think looking at the pattern of looking at the grass and the dirt pattern is a great image, of culture and society. We no longer have the dirt pattern at the net. It's all just there. So there it is. I like that.
There it is. All right. Well, to the topic at hand, to set aside a topic of the future. So, Carrie, you did your undergrad at Michigan. Is that correct?
Yep, that's correct.
Was it there? Yes.
Well, I was born in Michigan. I'm a Yooper.
So, but was it there, or did you go in with a thought that you wanted to specialize in this arena, or was it something that happened while at Michigan that directed you down this path?
It was definitely college. So I took, I got interested in political science in college, of course, because I didn't have a, sort of an emphasis on political science when I was in high school. But I took a great class with a professor who was just super engaging. And I think, a lot of times we all have some story about somebody who really motivated us. And so when I took the class with Ken Lieberthal, he really got me interested in Chinese politics in particular. All of my professors got me interested in political science just because they had the energy. It was more than just the knowledge, but I just felt energized going to class that I wanted to learn more. And so it really was Lieberthal who got me into Chinese politics in particular.
Okay. And so looking now as an expert in the field, when you consider China, in what way do people misunderstand China? And in what way do people perhaps overestimate some aspect of China?
Those are great questions. I think that, when we approach another country that we don't know as much about, we're obviously going to approach it with our own lens. So I think the biggest mistake is that a lot of times Americans will approach China in either the way that the media has given them certain bits of information that makes China seem like a threat. So even if you look at any of the headlines for the past X number of years, rise of China, threat of China, China is trying to become a hegemon. For the average person, they don't take the time to really dive in and understand, what China is about. So they get these little pieces. And from an American perspective, everything that China does is seen as a threat to the US, right? So those of us in the US, it's a more a matter of, well, if it's a rise of China, it's a zero sum game. And so therefore it must be the fall of the United States or it's going to impact us negatively. So I think that's the biggest misconception or the way that people approach it is they take these little snippets and don't have enough time really to dive into, what motivates and drives China.
As far as I'm curious, to what degree does China's neighbors have similar fears, or do they understand China differently because of their proximity compared to outsiders, not just Americans, but maybe Europeans or Latin Americans or what have you?
Of course. So your neighbors are definitely going to be more worried about you from afar. And again, different perspectives. I know we're not focusing on the United States, but whether it's Europe or whether it's even Australia, when you have a little bit of distance, it's easy to think that the first fallouts are going to occur in the areas that are surrounding it. So China's neighbors have not always had a good relationship with China. And so that does bring a little bit of concern. What China is doing in terms of foreign policy or, the potential security threats that it faces in its region are going to necessarily have impacts on its neighbors before it gets elsewhere. And so, other states in the area see China in more of a skeptical way. And of course, they also have the lessons from the past and thinking, if we don't pay attention, rise of Japan, if we're not paying attention, rise of China, these things could go awry. And it's better to be on the safe side than to think, oh, nothing's going to happen but with this. And so we can just kind of, see what occurs next.
Reminds me of the quote from Pierre Trudeau, the former Canadian Prime Minister, who said that being next to the United States is a little bit like sleeping with an elephant. You have to keep one eye open just in case it rolls over in the night. Is it that same kind of relationship? Or is
It's a little bit different. And I would say because it's not even so much that you're worried just about China, but there's just a lot of things that are happening in that neighborhood. So when you look at North Korea, when you look at Japan and Japan's concerns about its own security, you look at Russia. So it's got a lot of neighbors to worry about. Canada has, a big elephant, but it's not next to an elephant, a tiger, and a lion that could all decide to wake up and start to, change things up. So I do think it's a tougher neighborhood.
Hmm.
So push ahead 10, 20, 30 years. What's the trajectory, particularly of the relationship with the United States and China? Where is it heading?
A great question. Well, some of that will depend on US politics, of course. But I think if you take it aside, China's goal and rhetoric. So as Ross mentioned, how do we see China the way that China sees China or the way that China's trying to portray? And this is not to make it seem, I don't want you to get the impression that I'm going to make it overly rosy. But China's rhetoric has been about trying to create more of a multipolar world. And with that, there's room for other states. China does view itself as a defender of the interests of the developing world. So the little guy who ends up being able to become more successful, more powerful. And so if you took what they say at face value, 15, 20, 25 years from now, China is looking at the ability to have multiple voices and interests that are not just dominated by interests that currently run counter to its own. And so, in that sense, it would be, and this is the rosy part, right? So, in an idealized world, everybody's going to have more of an equal say at the table. You're going to have a lot of different interests that are represented. So that's one way to look at it. Another way would be to think, okay, so China may start to amass more power, and could that change the way that it sees itself, and could that make a shift in certain kinds of ways? I don't think when you look at capabilities and capabilities that are military capabilities, economic capabilities, and again, the political capital with others, that China has the ability currently to try to replace the US as a hegemon or emerge uncontested. And so that's where, it's an uncertain future. There's reason to pay attention, of course, and to educate ourselves about what China's doing, why it's doing it. But the future, I mean, if I knew the answer to that, I think I'd have a lot of great things.
Well, when you're talking about the fact that China inhabits a very rough neighborhood. Who are the people that they're least worried about? Maybe because they have good relations or they're more simpatico with their ideals. And which one, I think about, the Soviet Union always had concerns about Finland. They always had concerns about Yugoslavia. Part of it had to do with their armies, part of it had to do with their leadership. Is there somebody within the region that they're most worried about?
I think most worried about might be North Korea, only in the sense that it has the potential to bring a lot more interest to their backyard than they would care for. And so when you think about, who are China's allies, they're not quite like North Korea, where they don't have any friends, but they try not to have too many friends. Meaning that they don't want other states to be that close in more of a tight relationship. It's more a matter of every one of its neighbors has some reason to be a bit concerned. When you look at the rise of China's economy and you think about how that has an impact on neighboring areas, when you look at production that's moved out of China into places like Vietnam or Bangladesh, right? So looking at, again, the changes in production. If you look at the South China Sea, if you look at the situation with Taiwan, right? All of these things are interesting kinds of challenges where it doesn't have an ally that would be able to stand up next to it on all of these different issues, or that it would see as not threatening. Even a country like Vietnam, they have contested claims in the South China Sea, and you would think those two have the best potential to be close together. And North Korea, of course, again, brings too much attention to their backyard. It would be nice if that relationship were a little bit smoother.
So you're saying that the lack of allies, of the way that we might traditionally think of allies, is a conscious decision on the part of China.
Absolutely. By choice. They don't have a need for allies because, again, the rhetoric is that they are not trying to be expansive. So if you think about what China's been doing over the last X number of years, most of it has been sort of spreading goodwill, and I say goodwill with scare quotes, the Belt and Road Initiative. So trying to say, look, we're bringing in construction, we're bringing in economic benefits. We're not trying to see ourselves as a military power. Now, skeptics would argue, well, that's not exactly true, because you can look at the expanding, influence that their military is having by building areas in the South China Sea. You can look at the increase to the military budget. You can look at all of these things that give you these other kinds of signs. But ultimately, they are trying to dispel any concerns by saying that it's economics, right? So it's all about economics, and they need it.
So I'm one of the people who kind of look at the headlines and hear kind of the world is ending type narrative, and but the thing I've never really able to ask somebody who knows is just about the idea of surveillance and the government, and it seems like it's pretty developed, but it could again be overstated in the media. Do you have some insight there?
It definitely is very developed. And so when you look at surveillance, there are a couple of ways to look at it. So you can look at China's investment in technologies that have helped it develop more of a surveillance state domestically. And that we can see without a doubt they've been able to do. You can also look at this investment as part of its plan to, again, bring benefits to other states. So when you look at their investment in surveillance technology, they've also been able to, sell that to other authoritarian states that could then use it, that can't get it elsewhere, to use it to regulate their own population. So it truly is developing a niche area, both for domestic political concerns in terms of having the ability to watch the population more carefully, and then also has an export quality for states, which helps it build bridges with other states that are similar to it in terms of how they want to use it. So the level of development, of course, of the surveillance technology, it's been phenomenal for a long time. And part of that is because they don't have the regulations for privacy that we would have in a Western country like the US. So you and I would be upset with these red light cameras, and the Chinese people are used to at an intersection. There could be, 30 cameras looking at you, and that's just commonplace.
So it does sound like there are always two sides to these types of issues, and it's much more complicated than we think.
I think it's always good to think about it from these multiple perspectives. So it's one of the things that I love the most about international politics is, again, as a US person, we think of things from our lens, and you don't have to buy into what the other side is saying, right? So Chinese rhetoric says one thing, but you do have to be a little bit skeptical, but you still have to get a sense if what they're saying is consistent with what they're doing, even if you don't want it to be, then you have to look at how they're building their image to others and how they're trying to dispel any sense of concern to a certain extent.
So about 20 years ago, I met some folks from Iran, and I think it was the first time that I've intuitively understood that what the government is not necessarily what the people are. To what degree is what is the difference between the culture of the Chinese government and the culture of the masses? In what ways do they align? In what ways are they different?
That's a great question. And I have both an answer and a non-answer, which
Good.
is that when you think about it, my non-answer is, how can we really know? How can we really know what the average Chinese person thinks when it comes to politics and the government? And if they're in alignment, don't have the ability to in the kind of public opinion survey that would truly give us that free information to know with certainty. But what I can say, so my other answer would be there are certain parts about the Chinese government that you're obviously going to have a large, perhaps growing population that is dissatisfied. So dissatisfied with a number of different things. You can see this through different kinds of protests, whether it's labor protests, environmental protests, if it's women's movements. You have a lot of different elements of protest that shouldn't be allowed to exist or that we hear about that you might argue, well, these are small things, but what if they're not, if we had more information, right? So if we had more information, would these actually be larger? And then there's the other way to look at it, which is that the average person isn't thinking about the politics of the Chinese state in the same way that you and I are. So when you are in the system and you don't talk about politics and you don't see the political components of it, if this is just how you navigate life, you're not necessarily going to be critical. And I say that because oftentimes I'll have my students that will say like, oh, is the average person so upset and they want to overthrow the government and they're doing these things, like, are they upset they can't talk about democracy? Like, well, many of my students are not very political either. And so when you think about it, we're already interested in politics. So we're trying to read into what the average person might be thinking about politics. If you don't have freedoms of speech and you don't have access to certain things on the internet and you don't get exposed to these things, you're not thinking about them. It's not because you don't want them. It's just you're not thinking about them yet. And so that's one thing to kind of think about. We don't know how many people have access to the information and are just like, this is my life. I don't want to be a dissident, right? I don't want to rise up against the government, which there are a large number of people that would, be relevant for, versus the dissident population, which is actively trying to raise awareness about atrocities by the government, lack of human rights, treatment of minorities, right? All of those sort of things. That's my answer and non-answer.
Well,
Oh,
it's good to hear a more complete answer, because we're used to saying about 1 minute during a debate talking about China, talking tough about China, and about a minute and a half in a State of the Union address, talking tough, and that's it. So this, I think more of this conversation that the world needs to hear more detail about
And
this.
I will say this, presidents or presidential candidates cannot talk soft on China because nobody wants to hear that. Nobody wants to hear that China is not a threat. So, it is part of what they have to do to win the votes of the American public is to, be tough on China. Anybody soft on China is going to be the Beijing apologist or is going to be turning over the economy to the Chinese. And so that really is, you have to be tough, which isn't great for Sino-US relations to continually be tough on China.
one of the things I kind of curious about is just kind of being students of world politics and just history and that sort of thing. We know that sometimes relations are cyclical. We have had moments where we've been closer to China than others. I think after the Boxer Protocol, we started having folks come over and to study, and they brought that back to China. And not surprisingly, there was I don't want to call it a westernization movement, but certainly, you can put it in those terms. Um, there are some folks who believe that China is at an apex of its power. Could you see that if that's true, and I don't know if it's true, but if it's true, could you see relations with China by currently hostile forces or just suspicious forces? Can you see those relationships getting better, or do you think China is always going to keep one eye open to make sure that they protect what's theirs?
I don't see, I mean, we are at kind of a lowish point, right? When you look at US China relations. And a lot of that is because we view it as their rise as our fall. And so when you keep that mentality, whether it's on trade, whether it's on security issues, whether it's on diplomacy, whether it's, the Chinese BRI Belt and Road Initiative versus, the TPP. So you look at those kinds of things and we can't help but see China as posing this larger kind of threat. And so when you think about what that means for the future in terms of better relations, I don't know. Part of it has to do with stepping back a little bit from some of the penalties. In an outsider perspective, there's concern about Xi Jinping. There's concern that he is becoming more authoritarian. And so as democratic states look at that, they say, well, we can't allow an authoritarian state to gain so much political power, economic power, and again, being part of, a champion of the developing world. That's a lot of countries, it's a lot of people that can be compelled by that. So, when you add all of those things in, I would hope that relations could get better. But unfortunately, where we are right now is in a difficult spot. We don't find Chinese students wanting to or able to easily come to the US in the same ways that they could before. Post COVID has changed a lot of things. Of course, the trade war has changed a lot of things. Restrictions on Chinese investment because of, as Stephen pointed out, surveillance and technology. Concerns about Chinese ownership of companies. You have Huawei. You have all of these other things that U.S. has done to specifically, taper China's influence and also, protect security issues in the United States. So it's not to say that it's unwarranted, but the Chinese see this as a continual, like, look, this is what I'm doing to keep you from doing this, and I'm doing this, and I'm doing this, and I'm doing this. And so, relations aren't at a good place. They could get better, but it's also uncertain because Xi Jinping is cracking down a little bit more. And again, because of the prominence of, the United States and Western Europe in terms of wanting to forward democratic ideas, concern about China, befriending or assisting authoritarian regimes. And again, this larger global fight between authoritarian regimes and democracy and making sure that we don't see that shift in balance start to occur. So my long, again, non-answer, I feel like I have a lot of these long non-answers, it's complicated, right? So if the Facebook status is like, what's the relationship for the future? It's definitely going to be, it's the complicated face.
So is there actually an alliance with Russia and Iran and North Korea and China? Or is there anything going in that direction that's not fiction?
So I hate to say the word alliance because alliance sounds like it's a more of a solid friendship. Like I'm going to help you out no matter what. And I would say that it's more a collection of the what do they have in common? What do China, North Korea, Iran, and Russia have in common? They are not supportive of a Western dominated world. And so when you look at that, sort of US hegemony or Western Europe and, that combination of Western democratic ideals, they find themselves pitted in a balance between states that are clearly democratic, more for all of these freedoms, and it's the collection of others. So what they share in common are not to see a US driven global order. And I don't know that that would make them allies in the same, but they do find ways to help each other out. So that's why when you look at, even if we looked at just North Korea, right, North Korea's increasing or better relationship with Russia is also being complicated because the idea is that Russia needs military assistance, of course, in the war with Ukraine. So alliance is a little allies and alliance. I feel like is a little bit too nice to look at it. It's more a relationship of convenience.
Okay. But it certainly gets people's attention when we see the heads of state, um, shaking hands and seeming to, be of one mind in some way.
Yeah, absolutely.
You think that sometimes that the desire or the presence of those photo ops or that's part of a kind of a shot across the bow. We know they're going to freak out when they see this picture, or they're going to freak out when they see that this meeting is happening. You know, Sometimes you feel like you're getting your chain jerked a little bit because you feel like you're reacting to something, and that was the whole purpose behind it, was to get a reaction.
Well, and I think again, when we think about the lens that we come from, so we see that collection as a group of states, you might call them rogue states, but a collection of states that are against our interests, our collective interests. And so putting those states together, you say, oh, we automatically have a view in the public that this is a force to be reckoned with. It actually helps to have a more aggressive posture then towards these individual states. So from the Chinese perspective, that may not necessarily be beneficial because it just kind of amps up the Western view that this is a body to be reckoned with or a group of states to be reckoned with. But if you really pay attention to the historical relationship, I mean, even if you look at the Soviet Union, Russia to China, it hasn't been a good, steady relationship. The same with North Korea. And even if you look in the past few years, Xi Jinping and Kim Jong Un do not have the relationship that China had with Kim Jong Un's predecessors, right? So his father and grandfather. And we just automatically assume that these relationships are strong and solid and have been around for a while when we just start to pay attention to them a little bit more now, as opposed to looking at it historically. And if I can pull another state in, you mentioned Iran. China's had an up and down relationship. In the Iran-Iraq war, it supplied weapons to both sides. When it comes to watering down sanctions, China was active in watering down sanctions for Iran, and then it didn't, right? It pulled out because they saw their own needs to be a responsible stakeholder in the global community as being more important. So if I were a country like Iran, I would find that to be a bit problematic. China's not an ally that you can rely on. They are, willing to. There used to be the saying, that like bamboo, you blow in the wind, right? So they'll move as their interests change. Wow. To find, what is best for themselves. It's the one thing we can be guaranteed about is that China will adjust in ways that will benefit itself to the most ability. And that includes, that's why it doesn't have good friends, right? You and I, we think of our good friends. Our good friends are going to be there no matter what. From the United States perspective, the UK is a good friend, right? We know that they're going to be with us. Canada's a good friend. China's not a good friend to anybody, right? It just depends on what day it is.
I was thinking about the way that the Chinese government is today. If you set Mao aside, who is a figure, perhaps since Mao, that maybe a lot of people don't know about, that has had the biggest impact or influence on what the Chinese government is today?
That's a great question. So I think, Chinese politics really is the study of political elites. And so when you look at the different generations of leadership, so the easy answer to say, if we had to think of who is the most impactful, I would say Deng Xiaoping. Deng Xiaoping, of course, would be most impactful because of the economic reforms that created the economic giant that we see now. Now, anybody who follows Chinese politics, oh, that's an easy one, right? So you just look at the different political leaders. But unfortunately, that is how we have to look at it, because it's because of the way that the Chinese political system is structured. If we had all these organizational charts in front of you to look at in terms of who has power, the organizational charts really mean nothing. It's the Chinese Communist Party, and more importantly, it is who is the paramount leader. And so it was Mao before, of course, and he was so idiosyncratic that obviously he has a major and important stamp, and we know about the various campaigns through the 50s, 60s, and 70s. But if you look at Deng Xiaoping, he really, really changed China. Without him, would we see the China that we see today? Who knows? But it was absolutely transformative. And as we get further away, younger people now, we think of Mao, of course, and then you think of Xi Jinping, but you forget the people in between. And so Hu Jintao, Jiang Zemin, you can forget a little bit. But Deng Xiaoping really did have a transformative impact on the Chinese economy. And that's why we're paying attention to China now, is because of the Chinese economy.
When you talk about, you've mentioned on a couple of occasions, the One Belt, One Road initiative. Can you explain a little bit about what that is, why China's doing it, and why some countries have started to push back?
Great question. So the One Belt, One Road started off as One Belt, One Road, and now it's Belt and Road Initiative. So the BRI, just a name change, a rebranding. And it was designed to be the modern day Silk Road. So to try to connect China to the rest of the world over land. So you have the land part of it, which is the belt. And then you have the maritime Silk Road, right? So it's always really confusing. The road part isn't the land part, it's the water part. And the belt part is the land part. But the idea is to connect China to Central Asia, to Western Europe, to Africa, right? To really kind of create this larger economic integrative route that would enhance, of course, the Chinese economy by, allowing for different kinds of trade routes, but it would also invest in the countries along the Belt and Road Initiative. So truly trying to invest in all of these different areas with better roads and infrastructure, basically creating mini economic centers all along this that could also then idealistically help every state that accepts the Chinese assistance in order to bridge that gap that they have from other states, right? Nobody's looking at Central Asia and saying, oh, I think I want to invest in the economy here to kind of connect them to the rest of the world. But that's a route for China on its way to these other areas. And so it really is seen as this grand economic plan. The economic plan already has $1 trillion worth of investment, expected to have perhaps $8 trillion when it's all said and done. It's said to be, expected to be done in 2049, which would be the 100-year anniversary of the People's Republic of China. So it has all of these great political moments attached to it too, right? So massive amount of investment, and it's more than just the economic benefits that it brings to China, but it also then is a way that China sees itself as a champion of the developing world again, because nobody else is bringing this investment in. And so they have the ability, they have their own economic interest driving it, and it really is helping them create goodwill at first. I'm going to get to the other part of it, right? At first, because it's seen as a no strings attached in the initial stage, right? So the first part of it is like, oh, you look at other countries' investment from the United States or Western Europe, and they're not going to invest in states that have authoritarian regimes or that don't have the kind of economic freedoms that you would expect, right? We're not looking for opportunity to invest there. China is an equal opportunity investor. They're looking at it from their own perspective. And again, it brings benefits to those states, presumably along the way. So that's how they're packaging it. The second part, though, is why are states pulling away? And they're pulling away because they've seen that it's not no strings attached. There are strings attached. And the strings can be found in a bunch of different areas. So it's funny because China's investment, I'm kind of circle around this, but the investment that they've had in various African states, whether it's dam construction and infrastructure that has been going on for a while, those states already started to see the challenges of having Chinese investment. So Chinese investment comes with Chinese workers, with Chinese companies, and doesn't necessarily result in the kind of investment that many states were expecting. They're thinking, oh, this is going to create jobs, this is going to do all these other things. And it hasn't necessarily done that. The other part of the string is that if you don't pay back the loans in order to do these things, then you could lose those interests to China, right? So it's not, here's all this great goodwill, I'm taking all this money and investing it. It is, look, if you can't pay, we have to have something. And that's where you have the challenges like with Sri Lanka and others that, loss of control over ports and areas that have been invested in are seen as a new type of exploitive opportunity that China is engaging in. And so states are taking pause. There were around 149, I think, states or 147-ish states that had agreed to BRI money and investment. And some of those states have started to pull back because they've seen, where some of the challenges are.
To make it worse, you got countries like Greece who not only are trying to pull away, but then you have the rise of political parties within Greece that some people find unsavory, and it has a lot to do with people kind of standing up, getting their feathers ruffled because on nationalistic terms.
Right.
So, Carrie, what about the investment of China in the United States, particularly in real estate type investments?
So if you look at China, so if I were Chinese and I was looking at my own domestic situation, and given that, again, Xi Jinping has been a lot more tightening on various elements. So this occurs pre-COVID as well. And so when you see, Jack Ma and Alibaba having, a little bit of problem coming from the Chinese government because you see the rise of these, individuals and their economic empires and the technology and all that stuff that starts to gain a little bit more ground. That basically there used to be this old joke that an easy way to get yourself on the government's watch list is to make it onto the Forbes 500, right? So all of a sudden now we have to pay attention to you. So if I'm a Chinese person and I'm looking at what's my best investment, it's not necessarily going to be in China. It would be to look elsewhere. And so one of the trends that you're seeing in China is, pre-COVID, there was this effort to try to get the Chinese to spend more money. So to encourage consumerism. And after COVID, because you're looking at, the strict implementation of zero COVID policies, many Chinese people are concerned about the liquidity of their wealth. And so the desire to go abroad. So there was, of course, Chinese investment in the United States in real estate prior to. There are restrictions in place that make it more difficult in a lot of ways. But you can see, it's easier to invest your money in a free country where you don't have to worry about it being taken, where you can hide wealth in some cases as well, versus trying to do it at home. And so it's not surprising. I would expect any person of wealth in China to want to invest in real estate in the United States. Of course, also it's very valuable. So that's a good way to see how much real estate has increased. Anybody who's bought a home in the last X number of years can see that. So those are good. Those really are good investments. And again, if you think about it on a global scale, if I were Chinese, I would do the same thing.
From a geopolitical sense, you would have to imagine that the future for China is going to continue to have questions surrounding North Korea as long as that family is in charge and as long as it continues to be what it is, and Taiwan, But beyond that, you could read the tea leaves, as it were. What do you see as some projected long-term issues in China's neighborhood that they're going to have to be worried about?
Well, I mean, definitely they're worried about those two, right? So worried about North Korea and how that could bring, again, unwanted attention. Mostly U.S. attention would be less desirable. Taiwan is the one that everybody's been paying attention to. And so I can't tell you how many times in a week somebody will say, oh, do you think China's going to take over Taiwan? What is this going to mean? I don't want to go visit over in that area because I'm afraid war is going to break out. I mean, that's the biggest hot spot area to look at in terms of China's relationships in the neighborhood. South China Sea as well, right? So we've forgotten about it a little bit, but those are the big flashpoints, and Taiwan really is what's on everybody's mind, I think.
So with regards to the South China Sea, or you mentioned the fact that Vietnam has taken some umbrage to what China is doing. Um, can the same be said of Indonesia or the Philippines? Do they too? Are they with Vietnam on this? Or are they taking a different approach? Or
There are so many states with contested claims in the area, and part of that has to do with how China draws its line. And so, if you look at any map of the South China Sea, China has this line, this 9-dash line drawn. They call it the cow's tongue, and everything in there they see as being theirs. And the biggest issue is the construction of islands, artificial islands on top of shoals and reefs, which then give them the ability to sustain life. And the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea says that you have to be able to sustain life in order to, claim that territory. Many will see that as floating, aircraft carriers, basically, military bases that are there. So there are a number of states in the region that have contested claims. So it's the Philippines, it's Vietnam. You can look at Indonesia. You can look at Taiwan, Japan. Right, there are a number of states that again are concerned about what China's doing there, because it does bring them closer to them in case there are problems.
so it's pretty fascinating just kind of take a look at it as far as, I think as Steve mentioned before, and as you talked about, the way we view this is so limited. It's understandable because we're looking at it from our point of view and our interests, but that there does not seem to be enough attention paid to the other people in the neighborhood. Do you know your people in your neighborhood? The idea that there's going to be other powers that might have something to say before this is all said and done as to how things go going forward.
Yeah, I mean the challenge too, when you think about these other states, so the big states to look at, of course, Japan, South Korea, North Korea, Taiwan. So if you look at these entities, Japan, South Korea, of course, have the United States. North Korea, concerned about it, and we talked about Taiwan as well. The other states in Southeast Asia don't necessarily view China in a friendly manner, but what do they have for their protection? They do have, some of them have, relationships with the United States. The major organization, ASEAN in the region, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, is not a security arrangement. And so it is an economic arrangement for those states. It is a way for them to be a collective, but without it being a military alliance and having a way that brings them together. They are truly at the will of whether or not the United States or other countries, but primarily the United States, is going to find their interests of our interests to get involved. And that's a big gamble, right? Nobody wants to go up against China. Nobody, right? China also doesn't want to go up against other states, right? So it's two states that are seemingly peaceful and not hostile towards each other could still find themselves in conflict and war. But when you think about those smaller states, Vietnam, Malaysia, Singapore, Philippines, take any number of those states there, they're not in a great position. Politically, they can, not challenge China. Economically, their economies are dependent on China. And then militarily, they don't have the military power to defend themselves against China without a commitment from a Western alliance. And they don't have that solid commitment to protect them.
Interesting, because you mentioned what was originally created as CIETO, they came out of NATO and a lot of CINTO and all the other toads that came out. That the two major powers at that time were Australia and Thailand was supposed to be the bulwarks that would somehow, but you didn't mention that as far as the regional forces that could potentially have an issue or cause an issue.
Yeah, there's no teeth, right? So that's a tiger with no teeth. And so, tiger with no teeth is a little bit like no teeth and no claws is a little bit less scary, right? It's just a big cat. Mm-hmm. And so that there really isn't a lot for China to be concerned about. It's not even so much that if other states decided to engage in a collective military alliance that they couldn't try to check China, but why would they do it? Right? What would be the impetus to say this is what I'm going to draw the line on? I'm going to come to the Philippines' defense against China, as opposed to thinking of there's some other way that we can resolve this conflict that doesn't involve the use of military force. And in that case, again, a big scary tiger with no claws and no teeth is scary, but it is not going to deter China from engaging in any kind of negative activity. And again, I don't see China as being hostile or aggressive towards these other states, but you don't want to say that that couldn't happen at some point in the future.
So, Herr Miller, you wanted to have a couple of these sessions with Carrie. You mentioned
Yeah.
before that there are two sides, and we're treating one now, kind of the geopolitical. What was the other?
Well, I think when you look at China, what I talked to Carrie about beforehand was the idea that this could be a geopolitical conversation, this could be a cultural conversation, this could be historical, which, as we know, is hand in hand with the geopolitical side of things. But not just that, but also the idea of looking at other aspects of China. A lot of people talk about their education system, and given that that's our previous bailiwick is education and teaching in the classroom. It is something that I think would be a very interesting conversation.
I like it. Well, today I feel like I'm on Fox News, CNN, talking about these current issues, and we could be famous by just taking these clips and but we're doing hard news. I think talking about all of those, the cultural side, the education, and we'd like to extend an invitation to do part two, part three, whatever. But this is high level stuff, and we appreciate it.
She could be
I
our
always love
pro
talking
from
about
Dover.
China.
Yeah.
Well, in that case, with that, and also we also have a Wimbledon issue, our tennis issue to come up in the future.
I'll watch the final. You convinced me to watch the men's final. The women's final already happened. I'm not going to say who won because some people record those things. But I definitely watch tomorrow morning real early.
And since I'm the only tennis ignoramus in this group here, this triad, I'll just throw bombs and you people will react and get upset.
You're good at that, Miller.
All right. Well, in that case, we thank you, Carrie, for joining us, and thank you for talking and sharing your expertise in the area. And I shall say adieu to you, Herr Dr. Bourgeois.
Auf Wiedersehen, Carrie. Thank you again.